Tomorrow morning the masons will arrive at dawn to seal you inside this tiny stone cell with nothing but a small window for food and waste. And you'll spend the next 40 years in this space that's barely large enough to lie down in. All because you believe this suffering will bring you closer to God. The cell measures 7 feet long, 4 feet wide, and just tall enough for you to sit upright but never stand. And once those bricks are mortared into place, there will be no door, no escape, no second thoughts, nothing but you and your prayers and the slow passage of time in absolute darkness. Your name is Julian and you're 23 years old. And in less than 12 hours you will be buried alive by your own choice in what the church calls the ultimate act of devotion, but what everyone else whispers about as madness dressed in holy robes. Before we descend into this forgotten chamber of medieval devotion and suffering, if you find yourself drawn to these hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from, because there's something profound about how we're connecting across time and space through our shared fascination with the past, exploring together these moments when faith and madness became impossible to distinguish from one another. You're standing in the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, and the year is 1373. And outside these stone walls, the world is still reeling from the Black Death that killed half of Europe 20 years ago, still trying to make sense of a God who would allow such suffering, still searching for meaning in a universe that suddenly seems arbitrary and cruel. The church is packed with people who've come to witness your enclosure, your living burial, your transformation from Sister Julian the nun into Julian the Anchorite, and they're all watching you with a mixture of reverence and horror because what you're about to do is considered holy, but everyone knows it's also terrifying beyond comprehension. The cell they've built for you is attached to the side of the church. A tiny stone box barely larger than a coffin stood on its end. And you've been inside it several times over the past weeks to prepare yourself, to practice existing in a space where you can't stand or walk or move more than a few feet in any direction. There are 3 windows cut into the walls, each one barely large enough for a hand to pass through, and these 3 small openings will be your only connection to the world for the rest of your life. The first window faces into the church so you can hear the services and receive communion. The second faces outside so the townspeople can bring you food and ask for your prayers. And the third opens into a small servant's room where your maid will live, the woman who will pass you meals and remove your waste and be the only human being you'll have regular contact with for decades to come. Your mother is crying in the front row, her face buried in her hands, and your younger sister Margaret is sitting beside her looking pale and shocked because even though you've been preparing for this for months, even though you've explained your calling over and over, she still can't understand why anyone would choose this, why anyone would walk willingly into a tomb while their heart is still beating. Your father didn't come, hasn't spoken to you since you announced your decision 6 months ago, because he sees this as a kind of suicide even though the church insists it's the opposite, insists it's the fullest expression of life dedicated entirely to God. The Bishop of Norwich is standing before you in his ceremonial robes reading from the office for the enclosure of an anchorite, and the words he's speaking are the same words used in funeral rites because in the eyes of the church you are dying today, dying to the world, dying to everything except your relationship with God. He sprinkles holy water over you in the cell, blessing this prison that will be your home, your church, your entire universe for the next 40 years if you live that long. And most anchorites don't because the conditions are so harsh, because the isolation breaks something essential in the human mind, because the body wasn't designed to exist in a space barely large enough to contain it. The bishop places his hand on your head and speaks the words that will seal your fate, telling you that you are being enclosed in this cell to live a life of prayer and contemplation, to intercede for the souls of the living and the dead, to become a living saint whose suffering and devotion will somehow balance the scales against all the sign and suffering in the world. He tells you that this is the highest calling a woman can aspire to, higher even than being an abbess or a prioress. Because you're giving up not just your freedom, but your very existence in the world, becoming a living ghost, a breathing corpse, a soul trapped between earth and heaven. The congregation is singing hymns, but you can hear the tears in their voices, can feel the weight of their horror and their awe. And you wonder if they understand that part of you is relieved, part of you has been looking for a way to disappear from a world that's always felt too large, and too demanding and too full of expectations you could never meet. When you were a child, your mother used to say you were too sensitive, too easily overwhelmed, too prone to hiding in dark corners where the world couldn't reach you. And maybe she was right. Maybe this is just the ultimate hiding place dressed up in religious devotion. They lead you to the entrance of the cell, a small opening in the wall that the Masons have left unsealed for this final moment. And you have to crawl through it on your hands and knees because there's no other way to enter. No door built for human dignity, just this small hole that you squeeze through while everyone watches, and then it will be sealed behind you forever. The bishop hands you a candle to light your way into the darkness, and as you crawl through the opening, you can hear your mother's sobs breaking through the hymns, can hear Margaret calling your name one last time, and then you're inside and the darkness swallows you whole. The cell is exactly as you remember from your practice visits, but somehow it feels smaller now. Feels like the walls are already pressing in on you even though you know that's just your mind playing tricks, just fear manifesting as physical sensation. You turn around to face the opening one last time and you see the faces of everyone you've ever known staring back at you. And then the Masons step forward with their bricks and mortar and they begin to seal you in, one brick at a time, each one blocking a little more of the light until finally there's nothing left but the 3 small windows. And the absolute certainty that you will never leave this space alive. The ceremony is over and everyone has gone home and you're alone in the darkness of your cell for the first time. And the silence is so profound it feels like a physical presence pressing against your eardrums. And you realize that this is what the rest of your life sounds like. This absence of sound, this void where the normal noise of human existence used to be. Your candle has burned down to nothing and you haven't lit another. One, because the maid who's supposed to attend you won't arrive until tomorrow. So you're sitting in absolute darkness trying to remember what the sky looks like, what it feels like to stand upright, what it's like to take more than 2 steps in any direction. The cell is so small that if you lie down diagonally, you can just barely stretch out your body, and when you sit up your head brushes the ceiling, and when you extend your arms you can touch both walls at the same time, and you're starting to understand that this isn't just confinement. It's a kind of compression, a gradual crushing of the human spirit under the weight of impossible limitation. You try to pray, but the words won't come because your mind keeps circling back to the same terrifying realization, which is that you chose this. You asked for this, you begged the church to let you do this, and now there's no way out, no escape clause, no moment of mercy when someone will open the wall and say it was all a test and you passed and now you can leave. Through the window that faces into the church, you can hear the night prayers being sung by the monks, their voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms of plainsong, and the sound is beautiful but also unbearably lonely because it reminds you that there's a whole world of human warmth and connection happening just a few feet away from you and you'll never be part of it again. You press your face against the small opening and you can see the flicker of candlelight in the church, can smell the incense, can hear the shuffle of feet on stone floors. And it takes every ounce of willpower you have not to scream, not to beg them to let you out, not to admit that you've made a terrible mistake. But you don't scream because you know they wouldn't let you out even if you did. Because once an anchorite is enclosed, the church considers them legally dead, considers the cell their tomb, considers any attempt to leave as a kind of resurrection that would violate the sacred vows you've taken. There have been stories of anchorites who changed their minds after a few days or weeks or months, who begged and pleaded and threw themselves against the walls, but the church never relented, never opened the seal, just let them rage and weep until they either accepted their fate or died from the despair of it. The first week is an education in the architecture of suffering, in learning how to exist in a space that actively fights against human life. And you're discovering that the physical challenges are almost easier to bear than the psychological ones because at least pain gives you something concrete to focus on instead of the growing horror of understanding what you've done to yourself. Your maid Alice arrives on the second day, a woman in her 40s who's been hired by the church to attend to you for as long as you live, and she passes you bread and weak ale through the small window, and her face is kind, but you can see the pity in her eyes. Can see that she thinks you're insane even though she'd never say it out loud. The routine establishes itself quickly because routine is the only thing that makes this bearable. The only structure that keeps you from completely losing your mind in the featureless darkness. You wake at dawn when you hear the bells for lauds, the first prayer service of the day, and you pray along with the monks even though you can't see them. Even though you're separated from them by stone walls and by the unbridgeable gap between the living and the living dead. Alice brings you breakfast through the window. Usually just bread soaked in ale because your diet is supposed to be as austere as your living conditions. And you eat sitting in the same position where you slept because there's nowhere else to go. No other room to move to, no change of scenery to mark the passage from night into day. The hours stretch out like centuries and you're learning that time moves differently in absolute confinement. That minutes can feel like hours and hours can disappear into a kind of gray nothingness, where you lose track of whether you're awake or asleep, whether you're praying or just staring into the darkness making sounds with your mouth. You tried to maintain the schedule of prayers that governed your life in the convent, tried to mark each canonical hour with the appropriate psalms and devotions, but without the structure of community, without other voices joining yours, the prayers start to feel hollow, start to feel like you're just talking to yourself in the dark. By the fourth day, you're starting to hallucinate, seeing shapes moving in the darkness, hearing voices that aren't there, feeling presences that you know rationally can't exist, but that feel absolutely real in the sensory void of your cell. The church would tell you these are visions, would insist that your suffering is opening doors of perception that allow you to see into the spiritual realm. But you know that this is just what happens when you deprive a human brain of normal stimulation. When you lock someone in absolute darkness with nothing to see or hear or touch except the walls of their prison. On the seventh day, you have your first visitor, a woman from the town who kneels at your outside window and asks you to pray for her sick child. And you realize that this is part of your function now. This is why the church values anchorites despite the horror of what they endure. You've become a kind of spiritual lightning rod, a person whose proximity to death and suffering supposedly gives them special access to God's mercy, and people will come to your window seeking prayers and counsel and blessings because somehow you're voluntary. Imprisonment makes you holy instead of just broken. Your body is staging a rebellion against the conditions you've imposed on it, and you're learning that human beings weren't designed to exist in spaces this small, weren't meant to go weeks without standing or walking or stretching their limbs to their full extension. Your muscles are cramping constantly because you can't move enough to keep them loose. Your joints are aching because you're always sitting or lying in the same few positions. Your spine is developing a permanent curve from the inability to ever stand upright, and you're only 23 years old, but your body is already starting to break down under the strain of impossible confinement. The waste situation is worse than you imagined, more degrading than anyone prepared you for, because Alice can only remove your chamber pot twice a day through the small window, and the smell becomes unbearable in the hours between. And you're living in your own filth in a way that feels designed to strip away every last shred of human dignity. Your skin is developing sores from sitting on the stone floor. Your hair is matting because you can't wash it properly with the tiny amount of water Alice brings you. And you're starting to understand that part of the Anchorite sacrifice isn't just isolation, but the gradual dissolution of the body, the slow process of becoming less human, more corpse-like, more suited to the tomb you're living in. The hunger is constant because your diet is deliberately minimal, just enough to keep you alive, but never enough to satisfy. And the church insists that this physical deprivation will heighten your spiritual awareness, will make you more receptive to God's presence. But mostly it just makes you weak and dizzy and obsessed with thoughts of food. You find yourself spending hours remembering meals you ate years ago, reconstructing the taste and texture of roasted meat, fresh bread, fruit still warm from the sun, all the ordinary pleasures of eating that you took for granted. When you have them, and that now feel like impossible luxuries from another life. Sleep becomes erratic because there's no day or night in your cell. No natural light to regulate your body's rhythms, just the distant sound of church bells marking the hours and your own exhaustion, determining when you collapse into unconsciousness. You dream constantly, and the dreams are vivid and strange, full of open spaces and running and the feeling of wind on your face. And when you wake up, the return to the reality of your confinement is so crushing that sometimes you weep for hours, curled up in the corner of your cell like a child, wondering how you're going to survive the next 40 years when you can barely survive the next 40 minutes. Something breaks in your mind around the 6-month mark, some essential connection between your sense of self and your ability to maintain hope, and you spend several weeks in a state that Alice later describes as a kind of walking death, still breathing and eating but no longer really present, no longer really human. You stop praying because prayer requires the belief that someone is listening, and you've lost that belief in the darkness of your cell. Lost the conviction that your suffering means anything beyond just suffering, that your sacrifice is anything more than just a waste of a human life. The visitors who come to your window seeking counsel and prayers become irritating because they can leave. They can walk away after 10 minutes and return to their normal lives with their normal problems, while you're trapped here forever in this stone box that's simultaneously too small to live in and too large to escape from. You find yourself giving them harsh advice instead of comfort, telling them that their problems are trivial compared to real suffering, that they should be grateful for their freedom instead of complaining about their petty grievances, and you can see the shock on their faces because they came expecting a holy woman and instead they found someone, bitter and angry and breaking under the weight of impossible isolation. Alice becomes worried enough to speak to the bishop about your condition, and he comes to your window one morning to check on you, to remind you of your vows and your calling, to tell you that this suffering is temporary, but the spiritual rewards are eternal. He talks about other anchorites who endured decades of confinement and emerged as saints, whose prayers and visions became treasures of the church, whose suffering somehow balanced the cosmic scales against all the evil in the world. And you listen to him and you want to believe, but you can't. You can't make yourself believe that your pain means anything more than just pain. But then something happens around the 1-year mark that changes everything, or at least changes enough to let you continue. And you're never quite sure if it's a genuine mystical experience or just your mind protecting itself from complete dissolution by manufacturing a sense of meaning. You're lying in the darkness of your cell one night, having given up on sleep, given up on prayer, given up on everything except the simple act of breathing, and suddenly you're aware of a presence in the cell with you. A warmth that seems to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, and you hear a voice that's neither male nor female, neither inside nor outside your head, saying simply, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Over the next several months, you have a series of visions that will eventually be recorded in a book called Revelations of Divine Love. And whether these visions are genuine encounters with the divine or just the hallucinations of a mind breaking under isolation doesn't really matter, because they give you what you need, which is a framework for understanding your suffering, a way to make sense of what you've done to yourself. You see Christ on the cross, but he's smiling, blood streaming down his face, but his expression full of love. And he tells you that suffering isn't punishment but participation, that by sharing in his pain you're somehow helping to heal the world's wounds. The visions come in waves, sometimes several in a single day, sometimes weeks of nothing but darkness and doubt, and you start writing them down on the scraps of parchment that Alice brings you, trying to capture the images and messages before they fade, trying to preserve whatever wisdom or insight might be buried in the delirium of your confinement. You write about God's love being like a mother's love, constant and unconditional and willing to endure any suffering for the sake of her children. And this image resonates with something deep in your own experience, some memory of being held and comforted before the world became complicated and demanding. The townspeople start hearing about your visions and more visitors come to your window. Not just seeking prayers now, but wanting to hear your revelations, wanting to understand how someone who's chosen such extreme suffering can still speak about God's love and mercy. You find yourself becoming the thing the church always intended you to be, a living saint, a spiritual guide whose proximity to death gives weight to her words about life. And the irony isn't lost on you that you had to become less human in order to become more useful to humanity. But there are still dark times, weeks when the visions stop and you're left alone with nothing but the stone walls and the smell of your own waste and the crushing weight of understanding that you'll never leave this cell alive, that your body will be pulled out through that small window when you finally die, and that's the only exit you'll ever have. You develop rituals to mark the passage of time, scratching lines into the wall with a nail Alice smuggled to you, one line for each day, watching them accumulate into weeks and months and years, each scratch a tiny act of resistance against the timelessness of your confinement. By the 5th year, you've adapted in ways you never thought possible, your body and mind reshaping themselves to fit the impossible confines of your existence. And you're no longer sure if this counts as survival or just a different kind of death. Your body has changed dramatically. Your muscles atrophied from lack of use, your spine permanently curved from never standing upright, your skin pale and thin from never seeing sunlight, and when you catch glimpses of your reflection in the water Alice brings you, you barely recognize the creature staring back. Your mind has changed too, adapting to the sensory deprivation by becoming more sensitive to the slightest stimulation, so that the sound of rain on the roof outside becomes a symphony. The taste of plain bread becomes a feast. The brief touch of Alice's hand passing food through the window becomes an overwhelming rush of human connection. You've learned to travel vast distances inside your own imagination, to build elaborate mental worlds that you can explore for hours at a time. And sometimes these internal landscapes feel more real than the stone cell that contains your body. The routine has become so ingrained that you no longer think about it, just move through the hours of prayer and meditation and writing with the mechanical precision of someone who's done the same things 10,000 times. You've memorized the sounds of the church services, can anticipate each prayer and hymn before it happens, can tell time by the quality of light that filters through your small windows, even though you can't see the sun itself. Your life has become a kind of meditation on limitation, an exploration of how small a space can contain a human soul before that soul simply dissolves into the darkness. The visitors still come regularly, and you've developed a reputation as a wise woman, a holy woman, someone whose counsel is worth seeking despite the horror of having to kneel at the window of her tomb. You give them advice drawn from your visions and your suffering, tell them that God's love is large enough to contain all pain, that no suffering is meaningless if it's offered up with faith, and you mostly believe what you're telling them, even though part of you knows that you're just making sense of the senseless, finding patterns in the chaos of human existence, because the alternative is to admit that it's all random and cruel and pointless. You're 33 years old now, the same age Christ was when he died, and you've been in this cell for 10 years, which means if you live as long as most anchorites, you're roughly halfway through your sentence, halfway through your self-imposed exile from the world. The realization should be devastating, but instead, it just feels like another fact, another piece of information to be noted and filed away, because you've become so good at not feeling things too deeply, at maintaining the emotional numbness necessary to survive in conditions that would drive most people insane within weeks. Your body is breaking down in predictable ways, the arthritis in your joints making every movement painful, the sores on your skin that never quite heal, the teeth that are starting to rot from malnutrition, and you know that you'll likely die in this cell long before your natural lifespan would have ended in the normal world. Alice is getting older too, moving more slowly, and you worry about what will happen when she dies, whether the church will find someone else to attend to you, or whether you'll just be left alone to slowly starve in the darkness. The visions have become less frequent over the years, but more profound when they do come. Less about specific images and more about overwhelming sensations of love and connection that leave you weeping for hours afterward, not from sadness, but from the intensity of feeling something beyond the numbness that's become your default state. You've written extensively about these experiences, filling page after page with attempts to capture in words what can only barely be expressed in language. And you know that someday after you're dead, these writings might be read by others, might offer comfort to people struggling with their own darkness. The townspeople who come to your window have changed over the years. The young couples seeking prayers for fertility now bringing their children, the children growing up and bringing their own children, and you're watching generations pass while you remain frozen in time, unchanging except for the slow deterioration of your body. You've become a fixture of the community, as permanent as the church itself, and people mark time by your presence, saying things like, "That was the year before Mother Julian was enclosed," or "that happened during Mother Julian's time," as if your confinement has become a measuring stick for the passage of years. 20 years into your enclosure, you experience what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, a period lasting several months when God feels completely absent, when prayer feels like shouting into a void, when all the visions and revelations that sustained you through the previous years suddenly feel like nothing more than hallucinations, born from isolation and desperation. You stop eating except when Alice forces food on you, stop maintaining your rituals and routines, stop responding to the visitors who come seeking counsel, and you spend days at a time just lying curled in the corner of your cell wishing for death, begging God either to give you a sign or to let you die because continuing like this feels impossible. Alice is terrified that you're dying, and she calls the bishop, who comes to your window and tries to talk you through this crisis of faith. But his words feel hollow and useless because he's never experienced anything like what you're going through, has never spent 20 years in a space barely large enough to contain a human body, has never had to watch his entire existence compressed down to a stone box and 3 small windows. You want to scream at him that it's easy to have faith when you're free. Easy to trust in God's love when you can walk away if things get too difficult, but you don't have the energy even for anger anymore. Just a vast gray emptiness that swallows everything. But then, in the depths of this darkness, something shifts. Some understanding comes that you couldn't have reached any other way. And you realize that this emptiness, this absence, this feeling of God being nowhere is actually just another way of experiencing God being everywhere. That the darkness itself is full of presence even when it feels like nothing but void. You start to understand that faith isn't about feeling God's presence all the time, but about continuing to pray even when prayer feels meaningless, about choosing love even when love seems like a lie, about surviving not because survival makes sense, but because giving up is the only thing that makes less sense. You emerge from this dark period changed in ways you can't fully articulate, quieter somehow, less certain about your visions and revelations, but more certain about the fundamental rightness of your choice to be here. And you start writing again, but now your words have a different quality, more humble, more aware of how little you actually understand about the great mysteries you're trying to describe. The visitors notice the change too, say that your counsel has become deeper, more compassionate, less focused on certainty, and more comfortable with doubt. And you realize that suffering has taught you something valuable after all, which is that wisdom comes not from having all the answers, but from learning to live with the questions. You're 53 years old and you've been in this cell for 30 years, longer than most anchorites survive, and your body is so broken now that you can barely move without pain, can barely remember what it felt like to stand upright or walk across a room or do any of the simple physical things that you once took for granted. Alice died 3 years ago, and a new woman named Margaret has taken over her duties. And sometimes you find yourself forgetting which one is attending to you, all the years and faces blurring together into a kind of eternal present where time has lost most of its meaning. You've reached a state that might be called acceptance or might just be exhaustion, a place beyond struggle where you simply exist in your cell the way a stone exists, without resistance or desire or hope, just being what you are in the space where you find yourself. The visitors still come, but you've noticed that they're bringing their children and grandchildren now. Whole new generations who've grown up knowing you only as the holy woman in the wall, who have no memory of a time when you were free, and you've become less a person to them than a kind of living relic, a piece of religious architecture that happens to breathe and speak. Your writings have been copied and circulated among educated clergy, and you've heard reports that people are reading your revelations in monasteries and convents throughout England, that your words about God's love and the meaning of suffering are offering comfort to people you'll never meet. And this knowledge gives you a strange satisfaction, even though it also reinforces the fact that your legacy will outlive your memory, that people will know your words without knowing anything real about the woman who wrote them. You wonder sometimes what they would think if they could see the reality of your existence, the degradation and pain and isolation that birthed those beautiful words about divine love. The visions still come occasionally, but they're gentler now, less dramatic, just quiet moments of feeling held and known and loved despite everything. And you've stopped questioning whether they're real or imagined because you've realized that the distinction doesn't really matter. That if something gives you strength to continue, then it's real enough regardless of its metaphysical status. You've become comfortable with paradox in a way you never could have been before your enclosure. Comfortable with holding contradictory truths simultaneously. Comfortable with not knowing. Comfortable with the vast uncertainty that underlies all human existence. You're 63 years old and you've been in this cell for 40 years. And you can feel your body failing in ways that tell you the end is approaching. The pain in your chest that comes more frequently. The difficulty breathing, the sense that you're slowly drowning even though you're surrounded by air. Margaret brings a priest to your window to administer last rites, and you can hear the prayers being said over you. The same prayers that were said at your enclosure 40 years ago, and you're struck by the symmetry of it, how your whole adult life has been bracketed by funeral rites performed while you were still breathing. You think about everything you've lost during these 40 years. All the experiences you could have had, the people you could have loved, the simple pleasures of walking in sunlight and feeling rain on your face and stretching your body to its full extension. And part of you mourns for the life you gave up, but another part of you, maybe the truest part, knows that you gained something too, something ineffable and strange, some understanding of what it means to be human that can only be learned through the experience of having your humanity compressed into its most essential elements, stripped of everything except consciousness and the capacity to pray. The townspeople gather outside your cell when word spreads that Mother Julian is dying, and they pray for you and with you. And you can hear their voices through the window. These people who've made you part of their lives for 4 decades, who've brought you their troubles and their joys, who've received your counsel and your blessings. And you realize that even though you were physically separated from them, you've been more connected to this community than you might have been if you'd lived a normal life. That somehow your extreme isolation created a different kind of intimacy. Your last visitor is a young woman who reminds you of yourself at 23, full of religious fervor and convinced that suffering is the path to holiness. And she tells you that she's petitioned the church to let her become an anchorite like you, to follow in your footsteps, to continue your legacy of prayer and suffering. You look at her through the small window, and you want to tell her not to do it. Want to explain that 40 years in a stone box is a price too high for anyone to pay regardless of the spiritual rewards. Want to save her from the fate you chose for yourself. But instead you just tell her that she should be very sure, that she should examine her motives carefully, that she should understand that once the wall is sealed, there's no going back. No moment when someone will rescue her from her own choice. Julian of Norwich died in 1416 after spending 41 years in her cell, outliving almost every other anchorite in recorded history, and the question of whether her survival represents devotion or destruction remains unanswered because perhaps both are true, perhaps they were always the same thing dressed in different words. Her body was removed through the small window where food had been passed for 4 decades, and the church immediately began the process of canonization, transforming her suffering into a tidy narrative about holiness while carefully editing out all the moments of doubt and despair that must have punctuated those long years in darkness. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well became one of the most famous lines in Christian mysticism, repeated by millions of people over 8 centuries, and most of them never knew that these words were written by a woman who spent 40 years in a space barely large enough to lie down in, who never again felt sunlight or stood upright or took more than 2 steps in any direction. The comfort her words provided to others came at a cost we can barely comprehend, purchased with decades of sensory deprivation and physical deterioration, and the slow dissolution of everything that makes us human. The cell still exists in Norwich, reconstructed as a shrine where pilgrims come to honor her memory, and most visitors stay only a few minutes because even imagining such confinement becomes unbearable, and they leave grateful for the freedom to walk away, to return to lives where doors open and spaces expand, and the world doesn't end at a 7-foot wall. Julian never had that freedom, chose to give it up at 23 and lived with that choice for 41 years. And whether she ever regretted it, whether she died at peace or in despair, whether her visions were divine revelation or just her mind's desperate attempt to create meaning in meaningless suffering, we'll never know because the dead keep their secrets. What remains is her writing, still read, still offering comfort, still making people believe that suffering has purpose and all manner of things shall be well. And maybe that's enough, maybe that justifies everything, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe nothing could justify 40 years in a tomb except the simple stubborn fact that she survived it, that she found a way to remain human in conditions designed to erase humanity, that she wrote words of love from a place of absolute isolation. And those words somehow still echo 8 centuries later, still offering light from the darkness where they were born.